Yes, ye moss green walls, ye towers defenseless, I revisit ye shame stricken. Where are all your trophies? Now, your thronged courts, the revelry, the tumult, that spoke the grandeur of my house, the homage of neighboring barons? Mysterious mother. Entering the castle of Ellangowan by a postern doorway, which showed symptoms of having been once secured with the most jealous care, Brown, whom, since he has set font upon the property of his fathers, we shall hereafter call by his father's name of Bertram, wandered from one ruined apartment to another, surprised at the massive strength of some parts of the building, the rude and impressive magnificence of others, and the great extent of the whole. In two of these rooms, close beside each other, he saw signs of recent habitation. In one small apartment were empty bottles, half-gnawed bones, and dried fragments of bread. In the vault which adjoined, and which was defended by a strong door, then left open, he observed a considerable quantity of straw, and in both were the relics of recent fires. How little was it possible for Bertram to conceive that such trivial circumstances were closely connected with incidents affecting his prosperity, his honor, perhaps his life. After satisfying his curiosity by a hasty glance through the interior of the castle, Bertram now advanced through the great gateway which opened to the land, and paused to look upon the noble landscape which it commanded. Having in vain endeavored to guess the position of Woodbourne, and having nearly ascertained that of Kippletringan, he turned to take a parting look at the stately ruins which he had just traversed. He admired the massive and picturesque effect of the huge round towers, which, flanking the gateway, gave a double portion of depth and majesty to the high yet gloomy arch under which it opened. The carved stone escutcheon of the ancient family, bearing for their arms 3 wolves' heads, was hung diagonally beneath the helmet and crest, the latter being a wolf-couchon pierced with an arrow. On either side stood as supporters, in full human size, or larger, a salvage man proper, to use the language of heraldry, wreathed and cinctured, and holding in his hand an oak tree eradicated, that is, torn up by the roots. And the powerful barons who owned this blazonry, thought Bertram, pursuing the usual train of ideas which flows upon the mind at such scenes, do their posterity continue to possess the lands which they had labored to fortify so strongly? Or are they wanderers, ignorant perhaps even of the fame or power of their forefathers, while their hereditary possessions are held by a race of strangers? Why is it, he thought, continuing to follow out the succession of ideas which the scene prompted, why is it that some scenes awaken thoughts, which belong as it were to dreams of early and shadowy recollection, such as my old Brahman Munshi would have ascribed to a state of previous existence? Is it the visions of our sleep that float confusedly in our memory, and are recalled by the appearance of such real objects as in any respect correspond to the phantoms they presented to our imagination? How often do we find ourselves in society which we have never before met, and yet feel impressed with a mysterious and ill-defined consciousness, that neither the scene, the speakers, nor the subject are entirely new, nay, feel as if we could anticipate that part of the conversation which has not yet taken place. It is even so with me while I gaze upon that ruin, nor can I divest myself of the idea that these massive towers, and that dark gateway, retiring through its deep vaulted and ribbed arches, and dimly lighted by the courtyard beyond, are not entirely strange to me. Can it be that they have been familiar to me in infancy, and that I am to seek in their vicinity those friends of whom my childhood has still a tender though faint remembrance, and whom I early exchanged for such severe taskmasters? Yet Brown, who I think would not have deceived me, always told me I was brought off from the eastern coast, after a skirmish in which my father was killed, and I do remember enough of a horrid scene of violence to strengthen his account. It happened that the spot upon which young Bertram chanced to station himself for the better viewing the castle, was nearly the same on which his father had died. It was marked by a large old oak tree, the only one on the esplanade, and which, having been used for executions by the barons of Ellangowan, was called the Justice Tree. It chanced, and the coincidence was remarkable, that Glosson was this morning engaged with a person whom he was in the habit of consulting in such matters, concerning some projected repairs, and a large addition to the house of Ellangowan, and that, having no great pleasure in remain so intimately connected with the grandeur of the former inhabitants, He had resolved to use the stones of the ruinous castle in his new edifice. Accordingly he came up the bank, followed by the land surveyor mentioned on a former occasion, who was also in the habit of acting as a sort of architect in case of necessity. In drawing the plans, etc., Glosson was in the custom of relying upon his own skill. Bertram's back was towards them as they came up the ascent, and he was quite shrouded by the branches of the large tree, so that Glosson was not aware of the presence of the stranger till he was close upon him. "Yes, sir, as I have often said before to you, the old place is a perfect quarry of hewn stone, and it would be better for the estate if it were all down, since it is only a den for smugglers." At this instant Bertram turned short round upon Glosson at the distance of 2 yards only, and said, "Would you destroy this fine old castle, sir?" His face, person, and voice were so exactly those of his father in his best days, that Glosson, hearing his exclamation, and seeing such a sudden apparition in the shape of his patron, and on nearly the very spot where he had expired, almost thought the grave had given up its dead. He staggered back 2 or 3 paces, as if he had received a sudden and deadly wound. He instantly recovered, however, his presence of mind, stimulated by the thrilling reflection that it was no inhabitant of the other world which stood before him, but an injured man, whom the slightest want of dexterity on his part might lead to acquaintance with his rights, and the means of asserting them to his utter destruction. Yet his ideas were so much confused by the shock he had received, that his first question partook of the alarm. "In the name of God, how came you here?" said Glosson. "How came I here?" repeated Bertram, surprised at the solemnity of the address. "I landed a quarter of an hour since in the little harbour beneath the castle, and was employing a moment's leisure in viewing these fine ruins." "I trust there is no intrusion?" "Intrusion, sir, no, sir," said Glosson, in some degree recovering his breath, and then whispered a few words into his companion's ear, who immediately left him, and descended towards the house. "Intrusion, sir, no, sir, you or any gentleman are welcome to satisfy your curiosity." "I thank you, sir," said Bertram. "They call this the old place." "I am informed?" "Yes, sir, in distinction to the new place, my house there below." Glosson, it must be remarked, was, during the following dialogue, on the one hand eager to learn what local recollections young Bertram had retained of the scenes of his infancy, and, on the other, compelled to be extremely cautious in his replies, lest he should awaken or assist, by some name, phrase, or anecdote, the slumbering train of association. He suffered, indeed, during the whole scene, the agonies which he so richly deserved, yet his pride and interest, like the fortitude of a North American Indian, manned him to sustain the tortures inflicted at once by the contending stings of a guilty conscience, of hatred, of fear, and of suspicion. "I wish to ask the name, sir," said Bertram, "of the family to whom this stately ruin belongs?" "It is my property, sir. My name is Glosson." Glosson, repeated Bertram, as if the answer were somewhat different from what he expected. "I beg your pardon, Mr. Glosson, I am apt to be very absent. May I ask if the castle has been long in your family?" "It was built, I believe, long ago, by a family called MacDingaway," answered Glosson, suppressing for obvious reasons the more familiar sound of Bertram, which might have awakened the recollections which he was anxious to lull to rest, and slurring with an evasive answer the question concerning the endurance of his own possession. "And how do you read the half-defaced motto, sir," said Bertram, "which is upon that scroll above the entablature with the arms?" I really do not exactly know," replied Glosson. "I should be apt to make it out. Our right makes our might." "I believe it is something of that kind," said Glosson. "May I ask, sir," said the stranger, "if it is your family motto?" No, not ours. That is, I believe, the motto of the former people. Mine is, in fact I have had some correspondence with Mr. Cumming of the Lion Office in Edinburgh about mine. He writes me the Glossons anciently bore for a motto, he who takes it, makes it. If there be any uncertainty, sir, and the case were mine, said Bertram, I would assume the old motto, which seems to me the better of the two. Glosson, whose tongue by this time clove to the roof of his mouth, only answered by a nod. It is odd enough, said Bertram, fixing his eye upon the arms and gateway, and partly addressing Glosson, partly as it were thinking aloud, it is odd the tricks which our memory plays us. The remnants of an old prophecy, or song, or rhyme, of some kind or other, return to my recollection on hearing that motto, stay, it is a strange jingle of sounds. The dark shall be light, and the wrong made right. When Bertram's right and Bertram's might shall meet on. I cannot remember the last line, on some particular height. Height is the rhyme, I am sure, but I cannot hit upon the preceding word. Confound your memory, muttered Glosson, you remember by far too much of it. There are other rhymes connected with these early recollections, continued the young man. Pray, sir, is there any song current in this part of the world respecting a daughter of the King of the Isle of Man eloping with a Scottish knight? I am the worst person in the world to consult upon legendary antiquities, answered Glosson. I could sing such a ballad, said Bertram, from one end to another, when I was a boy. You must know I left Scotland, which is my native country, very young, and those who brought me up discouraged all my attempts to preserve recollection of my native land, on account, I believe, of a boyish wish which I had to escape from their charge. Very natural, said Glosson, but speaking as if his utmost efforts were unable to unseal his lips beyond the width of a quarter of an inch, so that his whole utterance was a kind of compressed muttering, very different from the round, bold, bullying voice with which he usually spoke. Indeed, his appearance and demeanor during all this conversation seemed to diminish even his strength and stature, so that he appeared to wither into the shadow of himself, now advancing one foot, now the other, now stooping and wriggling his shoulders, now fumbling with the buttons of his waistcoat, now clasping his hands together. In short, he was the picture of a mean-spirited shuffling rascal in the very agonies of detection. To these appearances Bertram was totally inattentive, being dragged on as it were by the current of his own associations. Indeed, although he addressed Glosson, he was not so much thinking of him, as arguing upon the embarrassing state of his own feelings and recollection. Yes, he said, I preserved my language among the sailors, most of whom spoke English, and when I could get into a corner by myself, I used to sing all that song over from beginning to end. I have forgot it all now, but I remember the tune well, though I cannot guess what should at present so strongly recall it to my memory. He took his flageolet from his pocket, and played a simple melody. Apparently the tune awoke the corresponding associations of a damsel, who, close beside a fine spring about halfway down the descent, and which had once supplied the castle with water, was engaged in bleaching linen. She immediately took up the song. Are these the links of Forth, she said, or are they the crooks of Dee? Or the hanny woods of Warwick Head that I so fain would see? By heaven, said Bertram, it is the very ballad. I must learn these words from the girl. Confusion, thought Glosson, if I cannot put a stop to this, all will be out. Oh, the devil take all ballads, and ballad makers, and ballad singers. And that DDJ too, to set up her pipe. You will have time enough for this on some other occasion, he said aloud. At present, for now he sought his emissary with 2 or 3 men coming up the bank, at present we must have some more serious conversation together. How do you mean, sir, said Bertram, turning short upon him, and not liking the tone which he made use of. Why, sir, as to that, I believe your name is Brown, said Glosson. And what of that, sir? Glosson looked over his shoulder to see how near his party had approached. They were coming fast on. Van Beest Brown? If I mistake not. And what of that, sir, said Bertram, with increasing astonishment and displeasure. "Why, in that case," said Glosson, observing his friends had now got upon the level space close beside them, "in that case you are my prisoner in the king's name." At the same time he stretched his hand towards Bertram's collar, while two of the men who had come up seized upon his arms. He shook himself, however, free of their grasp by a violent effort, in which he pitched the most pertinacious down the bank, and, drawing his cutlass, stood on the defensive, while those who had felt his strength recoiled from his presence, and gazed at a safe distance. "Observe," he called out at the same time, "that I have no purpose to resist legal authority. Satisfy me that you have a magistrate's warrant, and are authorized to make this arrest, and I will obey it quietly, but let no man who loves his life venture to approach me, till I am satisfied for what crime, and by whose authority, I am apprehended." Glosson then caused one of the officers show a warrant for the apprehension of Van Beest Brown, accused of the crime of wilfully and maliciously shooting at Charles Hazelwood, younger of Hazelwood, with an intent to kill, and also of other crimes and misdemeanors, and which appointed him, having been so apprehended, to be brought before the next magistrate for examination. The warrant being formal, and the fact such as he could not deny, Bertram threw down his weapon, and submitted himself to the officers, who, flying on him with eagerness corresponding to their former pusillanimity, were about to load him with irons, alleging the strength and activity which he had displayed, as a justification of this severity. But Glosson was ashamed or afraid to permit this unnecessary insult, and directed the prisoner to be treated with all the decency, and even respect, that was consistent with safety. Afraid, however, to introduce him into his own house, where still further subjects of recollection might have been suggested, and anxious at the same time to cover his own proceedings by the sanction of another's authority, he ordered his carriage, for he had lately set up a carriage, to be got ready, and in the meantime directed refreshments to be given to the prisoner and the officers, who were consigned to one of the rooms in the old castle, until the means of conveyance for examination before a magistrate should be provided. Chapter 42. Bring in the evidence, thou robed man of justice. Take thy place, and thou, his yokefellow of equity, bench. By his side you are of the commission, sit you too. King Lear. While the carriage was getting ready, Glosson had a letter to compose, about which he wasted no small time. It was to his neighbor, as he was fond of calling him, Sir Robert Hazelwood of Hazelwood, the head of an ancient and powerful interest in the county, which had in the decadence of the Ellangowan family gradually succeeded to much of their authority and influence. The present representative of the family was an elderly man, dotingly fond of his own family, which was limited to an only son and daughter, and stoically indifferent to the fate of all mankind besides. For the rest, he was honorable in his general dealings, because he was afraid to suffer the censure of the world, and just from a better motive. He was presumptuously over-conceited on the score of family pride and importance, a feeling considerably enhanced by his late succession to the title of a Nova Scotia baronet, and he hated the memory of the Ellangowan family, though now a memory only, because a certain baron of that house was traditionally reported to have caused the founder of the Hazelwood family hold his stirrup until he mounted into his saddle. In his general department he was pompous and important, affecting a species of florid elocution, which often became ridiculous from his misarranging the triads and quaternions with which he loaded his sentences. To this personage Glosson was now to write in such a conciliatory style as might be most acceptable to his vanity and family pride, and the following was the form of his note. Mr. Gilbert Glosson, he longed to add of Ellangowan, but prudence prevailed, and he suppressed that territorial designation. Mr. Gilbert Glosson has the honor to offer his most respectful compliments to Sir Robert Hazelwood, and to inform him that he has this morning been fortunate enough to secure the person who wounded Mr. C. Hazelwood. As Sir Robert Hazelwood may probably choose to conduct the examination of this criminal himself, Mr. G. Glosson will cause the mail to be carried to the inn at Kippletringan, or to Hazelwood House, as Sir Robert Hazelwood may be pleased to direct, and, with Sir Robert Hazelwood's permission, Mr. G. Glosson will attend him at either of these places with the proofs and declarations which he has been so fortunate as to collect respecting this atrocious business. Addressed Sir Robert Hazelwood of Hazelwood, Bart. Hazelwood House, N.C., N.C. Elm. G.N. Tuesday. This note he dispatched by a servant on horseback, and having given the man some time to get ahead, and desired him to write fast, he ordered 2 officers of justice to get into the carriage with Bertram, and he himself, mounting his horse, accompanied them at a slow pace to the point where the roads to Kippletringan and Hazelwood House separated, and there awaited the return of his messenger, in order that his farther route might be determined by the answer he should receive from the baronet. In about half an hour his servant returned with the following answer, handsomely folded, and scaled with the Hazelwood arms, having the Nova Scotia badge depending from the shield. Sir Robert Hazelwood of Hazelwood returns Mr. G. Glosson's compliments, and thanks him for the trouble he has taken in a matter affecting the safety of Sir Robert's family. Sir R.H. requests Mr. G. will have the goodness to bring the prisoner to Hazelwood House for examination, with the other proofs or declarations which he mentions. And after the business is over, in case Mr. G. is not otherwise engaged, Sir R. and Lady Hazelwood request his company to dinner. Addressed Mr. Gilbert Glosson, N.C. Hazelwood House. Tuesday. So, thought Mr. Glosson, here is one finger in at least, and that I will make the means of introducing my whole hand. But I must first get clear of this wretched young fellow. I think I can manage Sir Robert. He is dull and pompous, and will be alike disposed to listen to my suggestions upon the law of the case, and to assume the credit of acting upon them as his own proper motion. So I shall have the advantage of being the real magistrate, without the odium of responsibility. As he cherished these hopes and expectations, the carriage approached Hazelwood House, through a noble avenue of old oaks, which shrouded the ancient abbey-resembling building so called. It was a large edifice built at different periods, part having actually been a priory, upon the suppression of which, in the time of Queen Mary, the first of the family had obtained a gift of the house and the surrounding lands from the crown. It was pleasantly situated in a large deer park, on the banks of the river we have before mentioned. The scenery around was of a dark, solemn, and somewhat melancholy cast, according well with the architecture of the house. Everything appeared to be kept in the highest possible order, and announced the opulence and rank of the proprietor. As Mr. Glosson's carriage stopped at the door of the hall, Sir Robert reconnoitred the new vehicle from the windows. According to his aristocratic feelings, there was a degree of presumption in this novice homo, this Mr. Gilbert Glosson, late writer in, presuming to set up such an accommodation at all, but his wrath was mitigated when he observed that the mantle upon the panels only bore a plain cipher of G.E.G. This apparent modesty was indeed solely owing to the delay of Mr. Cumming of the Lion Office, who, being at that time engaged in discovering and matriculating the arms of 2 commissaries from North America, 3 English-Irish peers, and 2 great Jamaica traders, had been more slow than usual in finding an escutcheon for the new Laird of Ellangowan. But his delay told to the advantage of Glosson in the opinion of the proud baronet. While the officers of justice detained their prisoner in a sort of steward's room, Mr. Glosson was ushered into what was called the Great Oak Parlour, a long room, panelled with well-varnished wainscot, and adorned with the grim portraits of Sir Robert Hazelwood's ancestry. The visitor, who had no internal consciousness of worth to balance that of meanness of birth, felt his inferiority, and by the depth of his bow and the obsequiousness of his demeanour, showed that the Laird of Ellangowan was sunk for the time in the old and submissive habits of the quondam retainer of the law. He would have persuaded himself, indeed, that he was only humouring the pride of the old baronet, for the purpose of turning it to his own advantage, but his feelings were of a mingled nature, and he felt the influence of those very prejudices which he pretended to flatter. The baronet received his visitor with that condescending parade which was meant at once to assert his own vast superiority, and to show the generosity and courtesy with which he could waive it, and descend to the level of ordinary conversation with ordinary men. He thanked Glosson for his attention to a matter in which young Hazelwood was so intimately concerned, and, pointing to his family pictures, observed, with a gracious smile, "Indeed these venerable gentlemen, Mr. Glosson, are as much obliged as I am in this case, for the labor, pains, care, and trouble which you have taken in their behalf, and I have no doubt, were they capable of expressing themselves, would join me, sir, in thanking you for the favor you have conferred upon the house of Hazelwood, by taking care, and trouble, sir, and interest, in behalf of the young gentleman who is to continue their name and family." Thrice bowed Glosson, and each time more profoundly than before, once in honor of the knight who stood upright before him, once in respect to the quiet personages who patiently hung upon the wainscot, and a third time in deference to the young gentleman who was to carry on the name and family. Roturier as he was, Sir Robert was gratified by the homage which he rendered, and proceeded in a tone of gracious familiarity, "And now, Mr. Glosson, my exceeding good friend, you must allow me to avail myself of your knowledge of law in our proceedings in this matter. I am not much in the habit of acting as a justice of the peace, it suits better with other gentlemen, whose domestic and family affairs require less constant superintendence, attention, and management than mine." Of course, whatever small assistance Mr. Glosson could render was entirely at Sir Robert Hazelwood's service, but, as Sir Robert Hazelwood's name stood high in the list of the faculty, the said Mr. Glosson could not presume to hope it could be either necessary or useful. "Why, my good sir, you will understand me only to mean that I am something deficient in the practical knowledge of the ordinary details of justice business. I was indeed educated to the bar, and might boast perhaps at one time that I had made some progress in the speculative, and abstract, and abstruse doctrines of our municipal code, but there is in the present day so little opportunity of a man of family and fortune rising to that eminence at the bar, which is attained by adventurers who are as willing to plead for John a Nokes as for the first noble of the land, that I was really early disgusted with practice. The first case, indeed, which was laid on my table, quite sickened me. It respected a bargain, sir, of tallow, between a butcher and a candlemaker, and I found it was expected that I should grease my mouth, not only with their vulgar names, but with all the technical terms and phrases, and peculiar language, of their dirty arts. Upon my honor, my good sir, I have never been able to bear the smell of a tallow candle since. Pitying, as seemed to be expected, the mean use to which the baronet's faculties had been degraded on the melancholy occasion, Mr. Glosson offered to officiate as clerk or assessor, or in any way in which he could be most useful. And with a view to possessing you of the whole business, and in the first place, there will, I believe, be no difficulty in proving the main fact, that this was the person who fired the unhappy piece. Should he deny it, it can be proved by Mr. Hazelwood, I presume. Young Hazelwood is not at home today, Mr. Glosson. But we can have the oath of the servant who attended him, said the ready Mr. Glosson. Indeed, I hardly think the fact will be disputed. I am more apprehensive that, from the too favorable and indulgent manner in which I have understood that Mr. Hazelwood has been pleased to represent the business, the assault may be considered as accidental, and the injury as unintentional, so that the fellow may be immediately set at liberty to do more mischief. I have not the honor to know the gentleman who now holds the office of King's Advocate, replied Sir Robert gravely, but I presume, sir, nay, I am confident, that he will consider the mere fact of having wounded young Hazelwood of Hazelwood, even by inadvertency, to take the matter in its mildest and gentlest, and in its most favorable and improbable light, as a crime which will be too easily atoned by imprisonment, and as more deserving of deportation. Indeed, Sir Robert, said his assenting brother in justice, I am entirely of your opinion, but, I don't know how it is, I have observed the Edinburgh gentlemen of the bar, and even the officers of the crown, pique themselves upon an indifferent administration of justice, without respect to rank and family, and I should fear. How, sir, without respect to rank and family? Will you tell me that doctrine can be held by men of birth and legal education? No, sir, if a trifle stolen in the street is termed mere pickery, but is elevated into sacrilege if the crime be committed in a church, so, according to the just gradations of society, the guilt of an injury is enhanced by the rank of the person to whom it is offered, done, or perpetrated, sir. Glosson bowed low to this declaration ex cathedra, but observed, that in case of the very worst, and of such unnatural doctrines being actually held as he had already hinted, the law had another hold on Mr. Van Beest Brown. Van Beest Brown. Is that the fellow's name? Good God! That young Hazelwood of Hazelwood should have had his life endangered, the clavicle of his right shoulder considerably lacerated and dislodged, several large drops or slugs deposited in the acromion process, as the account of the family surgeon expressly bears, and all by an obscure wretch named Van Beest Brown. Why, really, Sir Robert, it is a thing which one can hardly bear to think of, but, begging 10,000 pardons for resuming what I was about to say, a person of the same name is, as appears from these papers, producing Dirk Hatterake's pocket-book, mate to the smuggling vessel who offered such violence at Woodbourne, and I have no doubt that this is the same individual, which, however, your acute discrimination will easily be able to ascertain. The same, my good sir, he must assuredly be. It would be injustice even to the meanest of the people, to suppose there could be found among them two persons doomed to bear a name so shocking to one's ears as this of Van Beest Brown. True, Sir Robert, most unquestionably, there cannot be a shadow of doubt of it. But you see further, that this circumstance accounts for the man's desperate conduct. You, Sir Robert, will discover the motive for his crime. You, I say, will discover it without difficulty, on your giving your mind to the examination. For my part, I cannot help suspecting the moving spring to have been revenge for the gallantry with which Mr. Hazelwood, with all the spirit of his renowned forefathers, defended the house at Woodbourne against this villain and his lawless companions. I will inquire into it, my good sir, said the learned baronet. Yet even now I venture to conjecture that I shall adopt the solution or explanation of this riddle, enigma, or mystery, which you have in some degree thus started. Yes. Revenge it must be, and, good heaven! Entertained by and against whom? Entertained, fostered, cherished, against young Hazelwood of Hazelwood, and in part carried into effect, executed, and implemented, by the hand of Van Beest Brown. These are dreadful days indeed, my worthy neighbour. This epithet indicated a rapid advance in the baronet's good graces, days when the bulwarks of society are shaken to their mighty base, and that rank, which forms, as it were, its highest grace and ornament, is mingled and confused with the viler parts of the architecture. Oh, my good Mr. Gilbert Glosson, in my time, sir, the use of swords and pistols, and such honourable arms, were reserved by the nobility and gentry to themselves, and the disputes of the vulgar were decided by the weapons which nature had given them, or by cudgels cut, broken, or hemmed out of the next wood. But now, sir, the cloud, patched, shoe of the peasant galls the kibe of the courtier. The lower ranks have their quarrels, sir, and their points of honour, and their revenges, which they must bring, forsooth, to fatal arbitrament. But well, well. It will last my time. Let us have in this fellow, this Van Beest Brown, and make an end of him at least for the present.